So there was a little disagreement early on about how much we should work and how hard we should work. When we finished, Hotel California was like the last one on the cut, not the beginning on the of the record. When Henley turned around and went, "That's going to be our single." And I went, "Oh no, you got to be kidding." I wanted to kind of encapsulate all that into a song, kind of the history of American rock and roll. The answer was no. So finally, I don't know who sent who a legal notice or whatnot, but it just came down that there was no, and you're fine.
He was not just another guitarist. He was the man behind the solo that defined an era, the sound that turned the Eagles from a smooth country rock group into one of the biggest bands in the world. But the same solo that made Don Felder a legend also pulled him into a storm of power struggles, lawsuits, and betrayal. Fired not with a handshake but with a fax, erased from the story he helped write, Felder decided he would no longer stay silent. When he finally told his side, the truth he revealed shook the image of the Eagles forever. In 1974, the Eagles were already a rising name in American music. Their blend of country rock, soft harmonies, and catchy storytelling had earned them radio play and loyal fans. But the band still lacked something. They had the polish, but they did not yet have the firepower that could make a crowd roar in a stadium. That missing piece arrived the day Don Felder walked through the door. He was not just a hired hand. He was a player with the kind of tone and skill that could flip a song from a gentle breeze into a storm. From the moment his guitar cut through their arrangements, the band's sound shifted. Tracks that once leaned heavily on country influences suddenly carried a harder edge, and the Eagles began to feel less like a folk rock act and more like a rock powerhouse. Felder's playing did not just add texture, it gave the Eagles a new identity. Fans could hear it instantly. The live shows sounded bolder, the recordings sharper, and suddenly the Eagles were not just chasing hits, they were building an empire. But with that change came tension. Felder was not content to play along quietly. He brought his own vision, his own musical instincts, and he was not afraid to speak up. Inside a group where every chord seemed to go through the filter of Don Henley and Glenn Frey, Felder's growing influence was both an asset and a threat. He could elevate the music to another level, but the more essential he became, the more questions started to hang in the air. Who really controlled the Eagles? Was it the collective, or was it a two-man empire dressed up as a band? For the fans, the harmonies sounded perfect. For the musicians inside the machine, cracks were already starting to show. Felder did not know it yet, but the seeds of future conflict were already being planted. He had given the Eagles the power to fill arenas, but he had also entered a system where power was guarded, not shared. If Don Felder's arrival gave the Eagles new muscle, then Hotel California cemented his place in music history. The song did not begin as a masterpiece. It began quietly, in Felder's Malibu beach house, with him tinkering on a 12-string guitar. What came out of that room was a haunting melody, something that felt both bright and ominous, a sound that hinted at beauty, but carried a shadow underneath. He recorded a rough demo, no polished studio equipment, no elaborate production, just his guitar, a reel of tape, and the feeling that he was onto something. When he passed it along, Don Henley and Glenn Frey heard more than just a sketch. They heard the skeleton of what would become the band's defining track. The arrangement evolved piece by piece. Henley shifted the key to match his vocal range, and slowly the track grew from Felder's skeleton into the soaring cinematic song we know today. But at the heart of it all, that foundation remained Felder's. Those rolling chord changes and that unforgettable guitar progression stayed exactly as he had created them. When it came time to perform it live, the challenge was clear. The record stacked multiple guitar layers to create that wide electric wall of sound. How could one man replicate that on stage? Felder solved it with a custom double-neck guitar, allowing him to jump between parts seamlessly so the song hit with the same force in front of a crowd as it did blasting from a turntable. Then came the solo. It was not just technical brilliance. It was storytelling without words. The solo climbed, spiraled, and burned itself into the DNA of rock history. Fans did not just listen to it, they memorized it, note for note. For many, it became the ultimate Eagles moment, the line that made their careers immortal. Yet that spotlight was also a curse. By becoming the architect of their biggest musical triumph, Felder also became a flashpoint in the band's internal battles. He had delivered the sound that carried them to superstardom, but it tied him to a song that would forever be both his crown jewel and his chain. Every time he played it, the crowd erupted, and every time it reminded the band's leaders that one of their most powerful weapons came from the man they did not want to share power with. Behind the scenes, the Eagles were less like a band and more like a corporation. Don Henley and Glenn Frey were not just frontmen, they were the board of directors. They had the final word on which songs made it onto an album, which setlists shaped a tour, and most importantly, how the money was divided. To the outside world, the Eagles were five equals blending harmonies and sharing the stage. Inside, it was clear that the balance of power tilted heavily toward two people. For Don Felder, who had already proven his value with the riff that birthed Hotel California, the imbalance grew harder to ignore. The flashpoint came after the band's 1994 reunion, a tour famously called Hell Freezes Over. It was a victory lap, a celebration of their legacy, and a massive financial success. But beneath the cheers and sold-out arenas, resentment brewed. Felder began asking the questions no one else wanted to raise. Why were Henley and Frey pulling larger shares of the revenue when the work was carried on the shoulders of the entire band? Why were creative decisions treated like orders instead of discussions? Felder was not angling for a power grab. He simply wanted fairness. He wanted the same deal that had existed when the Eagles were first formed, when every member shared equally in the risk and reward. But Henley and Frey did not see it that way. To them, the band's survival depended on strong leadership, and in their eyes, they were the only ones capable of steering the ship. Felder's insistence on transparency and equal treatment was not seen as protecting the group. It was seen as disloyalty. Soon, words like difficult and hard to work with were being attached to his name, labels that carried more weight in the industry than most fans realize. What made the situation worse was how deeply personal it felt. Felder had poured his soul into the music. He had brought in the riffs, the solos, the energy that helped the Eagles make the leap from a respected act to one of the most successful bands in history. Yet the moment he started asking about fairness, he found himself treated as if he were expendable. Every conversation became a standoff. Every rehearsal carried unspoken tension. The breaking point came in 2001, and when it did, it was as cold and impersonal as possible. Don Felder was not called into a meeting. He was not sat down for a difficult conversation about creative differences. He did not even get a phone call. Instead, after nearly 3 decades of shaping the sound of one of the biggest bands in the world, he was handed a fax, a short, blunt notice. He was out, fired from the Eagles without warning, without explanation, and without the respect of a face-to-face conversation.
The answer was no. So finally, I don't know who sent who a legal notice or whatnot, but it just came down that there was no and you're fired.
For Felder, the message was clear. He was not part of the family anymore. He was a name on a payroll that 2 men had decided to erase. That dismissal did not just strip Felder of his position. It cut him off from the very legacy he had helped build. Suddenly, the man who co-wrote Hotel California and played one of the most famous guitar solos of all time had no official claim to the story being told under the Eagles' name. Felder was not willing to accept that. Within months, the dispute turned into a full-blown legal war. Felder filed a lawsuit against Don Henley and Glenn Frey, accusing them of breach of contract, wrongful termination, and unfair distribution of profits. He claimed the band's financial structure had been rigged to favor its leaders while sidelining the very people who helped make the music that sold millions. The response was immediate and aggressive. Henley and Frey countered with their own legal filings, painting Felder as a disgruntled ex-member trying to cash in on past glories. The media picked up the story quickly, and fans who had always imagined the Eagles as a united front were suddenly watching headlines about corporate battles, bitter accusations, and courtroom maneuvering. For Felder, the lawsuit was not just about money. It was about recognition, about fighting to prove that he was not a replaceable part. He wanted the world to know that the Eagles' history was not written by 2 men alone. His guitar, his creativity, and his ideas were just as important. The fight was draining financially and emotionally. It dragged on for years, each side refusing to yield, each motion filed in court dragging the wounds deeper. Finally, in 2007, the case was settled out of court. The exact terms were kept private, sealed behind non-disclosure agreements, but one thing was clear: the scars would never fully heal. When the lawsuits ended, Don Felder still carried a weight that no legal settlement could erase. He had spent years inside a machine run on control, secrecy, and loyalty to two men at the top. Now that he was out, he decided the only way to reclaim his part of the story was to tell it himself. In 2008, he released his memoir, Heaven and Hell: My Life in the Eagles, 1974 to 2001. It was not polished PR. It was not written to protect reputations or keep old friendships alive. It was raw, unfiltered, and deeply personal. Felder laid out everything from the early days when the band still felt like a family, to the bitter years when business decisions replaced brotherhood. He described Glenn Frey and Don Henley not as distant legends, but as men who consolidated power, shut out other voices, and built the Eagles into a corporate empire with themselves at the top. The book immediately stirred controversy. Fans who had always imagined the Eagles as a harmonious group suddenly saw a different picture: endless arguments, petty fights, and contracts that felt more like chains than agreements. Felder did not soften his language. He admitted his own faults, short temper, frustration, moments of exhaustion, but he also painted a clear portrait of what it felt like to be silenced in a band you helped define. Don Henley and Glenn Frey, backed by their lawyers, pushed back hard. They accused Felder of violating confidentiality agreements, of profiting off private disputes that should have stayed hidden. Legal teams tried to block parts of the book's release, particularly the audiobook, where Felder's words carried an even sharper edge when spoken aloud. The backlash did not silence Felder. If anything, it gave his words more power. Readers and journalists devoured the memoir, eager to finally see behind the curtain of one of rock's most famously secretive bands. Heaven and Hell was not just a book. It was a declaration. Felder could not go back into the Eagles, but he could make sure that history did not erase him. By writing down his truth, he forced the world to acknowledge his role, his struggles, and the cost of being caught in a system where music became secondary to control. Once Don Felder closed the door on the Eagles and put his side of the story into print, many expected him to fade quietly into the background, living off royalties and letting the past define him. But Felder had no interest in retirement or nostalgia. He was not just a man who once played Hotel California. He was still a songwriter, still a guitarist, and still hungry to prove that his identity stretched far beyond the shadow of his old band. In 2012, he released Road to Forever, his first solo album in decades, and it carried the sound of someone processing years of conflict, betrayal, and change. The songs were not veiled love letters to his past. They were direct reflections of survival. Tracks spoke about resilience, about loss, and about picking yourself up when the system has already counted you out. The album's release was followed by tours where Felder stepped into a role he had rarely held before: frontman. For years, he had been part of a unit where his guitar was the weapon and someone else's voice carried the spotlight. Now, he stood at the center, singing his own words, telling his own story, and controlling the set list. The crowds were not as massive as the stadium audiences of the Eagles, but they were dedicated, often filled with fans who came not just for the music, but to support the man they felt had been wronged. By 2019, Felder raised the stakes with American Rock and Roll, an album that pulled in some of the biggest names in the industry: Slash, Sammy Hagar, Mick Fleetwood, Joe Satriani, and Chad Smith, to name a few. The collaborations sent a clear message. Felder was not a relic of the 1970s. He still commanded the respect of some of rock's most powerful players. In 2025, he unveiled The Vault, 50 Years of Music, a project that dug into decades of demos, unreleased songs, and hidden gems that had been sitting untouched. Rather than simply dumping old tapes onto the market, Felder carefully re-recorded, remixed, and reshaped the material, treating it like an excavation of his own history. The album showcased the full range of his career and proved that he was still creating and still evolving, even after half a century in the business. By the time Don Felder reached his late 70s, he had lived through almost every twist that rock and roll could throw at a man: fame, betrayal, courtrooms, reinvention, and redemption. But in February 2025, during a performance aboard the rock legend's cruise, the reality of age came crashing in. In the middle of playing Tequila Sunrise, Felder suddenly faltered. The music stopped and crew rushed him off stage. Within hours, word came back. It was severe dehydration, made worse by harsh weather conditions. After a short hospital stay, Felder himself released a message, reassuring everyone that he was fine and would return to the stage soon. What struck people most was not that the incident slowed him down, it was that he bounced back with gratitude, not bitterness. Felder acknowledged his limits, but he did not use them as an excuse to fade away. Instead, he spoke about balance, about choosing carefully where to spend his energy, and about valuing the moments he still had on stage. The anger that once fueled a book and a lawsuit had cooled into something different: acceptance. In interviews from 2024 and 2025, Felder said being forced out of the Eagles had been a blessing in disguise. He had learned the difference between obedience and cooperation, between being part of a team and being controlled by one. Even in moments when reporters tried to dig up old feuds, Felder's answers showed a man unwilling to fight ghosts anymore. He admitted he had tried to reach out to Glenn Frey before Frey's death in 2016, but got no response. When Frey passed, Felder attended the memorial, speaking with quiet respect while acknowledging that the gap between them had never closed. About Don Henley, he was equally direct. They remained distant, with minimal contact at occasional events, but he no longer carried the weight of old grudges. For Felder, forgiveness no longer meant excusing what happened. It meant refusing to carry the burden of anger. He no longer asked for apologies. He no longer demanded credit. He understood that history would sort itself out. What mattered was that he was still here, still playing, still writing, and still proving that music, not politics, not lawsuits, was the real legacy he wanted to leave behind. When people talk about the Eagles, the names that come up first are almost always Don Henley and Glenn Frey. They were the faces on the posters, the voices on the radio, and the men who turned the band into a corporation as much as a creative force. But ask fans what moment truly defined the Eagles, and most will point to one thing: the guitar solo on Hotel California. That solo was not Henley's or Frey's. It was not dreamed up in a boardroom or dictated by contracts. It came from Don Felder, sitting alone with a 12-string in Malibu, creating a sound that would echo for generations. Even though his name was later pushed to the margins of the official history, the music itself never let the world forget. Every time those notes play, Felder's place in the story is undeniable. For Felder, that became enough. He stopped waiting for public apologies or invitations to reunite. He no longer demanded his name be highlighted in glossy documentaries or official press releases. Instead, he leaned into something more lasting: the knowledge that time sorts out what contracts try to erase. Fans know who wrote that riff, musicians know who crafted that solo, and the respect he still earns from peers, guitar giants like Slash, Joe Satriani, and Steve Lukather, proves that his legacy is not dependent on the approval of those who once pushed him out. On stage today, Felder does not play to prove a point. He plays because it is who he is. When Hotel California closes his set, he does not reinvent it or try to outdo the original. He performs it note for note, exactly as fans remember, as if preserving a monument. To him, that is respect, not just for the work, but for the people who carried it with them through decades of their lives. Looking back, Felder's story is one of contradictions. He was part of one of the most successful bands of all time, yet treated like an outsider. He wrote music that defined a generation, yet fought to keep his name attached to it. He endured betrayal and lawsuits, but came out the other side with perspective and even forgiveness. His legacy is proof that sometimes history forgets the official version and remembers the truth instead. Don Felder may never headline the Eagles story in the way Henley and Frey do, but he does not need to. His notes already tell the story for him. They always will.